The letter hit the dirt at Elijah Hunter's boots like an accusation. Maggie Bancroft had not thrown it exactly. She had let it fall from her fingers with the kind of deliberate calm that was somehow more devastating than rage, and the single folded page landed face up in the dust of the Hunter Ranch yard, so that the words "contract terminated" were perfectly readable to any man with eyes and enough shame to look. Elijah had both. He stared at the letter for a moment that stretched out long and terrible, and the June sun of 1882 bore down on the back of his neck like a brand. Behind him, somewhere in the barn, one of his sons was crying, though whether it was Cole or Jesse or little Thomas he could not tell, because the sound was muffled and raw and honest in the way that only 8-year-olds allow themselves to be honest. Maggie was already walking back toward the house, her back straight, her dark braid catching the light, and she was walking with the specific posture of a woman who has made an irrevocable decision and intends to honor it. Maggie. His voice came out rougher than he intended. It always did lately. Every conversation with her turned his throat into gravel. She stopped. She did not turn around. "If you walk through that door," he said, "then what? You just leave. You came out here and you made them." He stopped. He could feel the truth of what he was about to say pressing behind his sternum like a fist, and he was not a man who had ever been comfortable with that kind of pressure. "You made them love you," he finished. "All 3 of them, and that was not part of any contract." She turned then. Her eyes, which were a precise and unremarkable brown in ordinary light, but somehow managed to carry the quality of deep water when she was thinking hard, fixed on him from across the yard. "No," she said quietly. "It was not. That part happened for free." The silence between them was the loudest thing on the whole of the Kansas plains. And then Thomas appeared in the barn doorway with hay in his hair and tears tracking through the dust on his face. And Jesse was right behind him with one hand on his little brother's shoulder, the way a 10-year-old tries to manage a world that is coming apart. And Cole, the eldest at 13, stood apart from both of them with his jaw set in the precise expression that Elijah saw every morning in his shaving mirror. And the whole tableau burned itself into Elijah's chest like a coal. This was not how it was supposed to end. This was not how any of it was supposed to go. To understand how Maggie Bancroft came to be standing in the yard of the Hunter Ranch on a June morning in 1882, with a terminated contract at Elijah Hunter's feet and 3 heartbroken boys in the barn doorway, you had to go back 6 months, to the particular kind of desperation that can seize a man in December when the wind off the plains has no mercy, and the house is full of needs he cannot meet. Elijah Hunter had come to Kansas from Missouri in 1871 with his wife Sarah, $100, a team of horses, and the specific, unafraid ambition of a 24-year-old man who does not yet know what he does not know. By 1875, they had 400 acres, a solid house, a small herd, and Cole, who arrived with his mother's blue eyes and Elijah's stubbornness already fully formed. Jesse came in 1877 and Thomas in 1879, and the ranch grew alongside the boys in the way that a good life does, steadily and without drama. Sarah died in the autumn of 1880 from a fever that came on fast and left no room for goodbyes. She was there on a Tuesday, burning and struggling to breathe, and by Friday she was gone, and the silence she left behind was of a quality that Elijah had never encountered before and could not describe to another person even when pressed. It was not merely the absence of her voice. It was the absence of the particular kind of order she had maintained, the warm intelligence of a woman who knew exactly how a household worked and made it look effortless. Without her, the house began to come apart at the seams in small and then increasingly large ways, and the boys, who were 7, 5, and 2 when they lost their mother, were growing up in a kind of educational wilderness that ate at Elijah worse than the loneliness. He could work the land. He could push cattle and repair fences and negotiate with buyers and make the ranch pay. What he could not do was teach his sons to read with any patience, or explain mathematics beyond the arithmetic of livestock and acreage, or give Cole the kind of thorough, organized schooling that a 13-year-old in 1882 needed if he was going to have options in the world beyond this particular patch of Kansas. The schoolmaster in Weston, the nearest town of consequence, was a man named Gerald Prout who was adequate for the town children, but made the 12-mile round trip impractical for daily attendance by the Hunter boys. Elijah had tried it for a year. Thomas was too young for the distance. Jesse had missed so much school due to ranch demands that he was falling behind. Cole was bored and restless and increasingly resentful of the wasted days. In December of 1881, Frank Donahue, who ranched the adjacent property and had 7 children and a managing wife, suggested to Elijah over a fence post and a shared bottle of rye that what he needed was a schoolteacher who would come to the ranch. A governess of a practical Western sort. Not the soft kind from the Eastern novels, Frank said, laughing, but the real kind who could hold her own on a working ranch and still teach the boys their letters and numbers without requiring the household to stop functioning around her. Elijah had placed an advertisement in 3 papers, including the Topeka Daily Capital, in January of 1882. He had been specific in a way that embarrassed him slightly, but that he considered necessary. He needed someone capable. He needed someone who understood that a working ranch was not a parlor. He needed someone who could teach all 3 boys at their different levels and who would not be overcome by the distance from town or the roughness of frontier life. He offered a fair wage, a private room in the house, and the duration of 1 year to be renegotiated at the end. He received 11 responses. 9 of them he eliminated immediately, for reasons he could not always fully articulate, but that came down, in most cases, to a quality of fragility in the prose that worried him. 1 response was from a man, which he had not considered but found he had no particular objection to, except that the man's references were vague, and he thought, with 3 boys already missing a mother's presence, that the situation called for something else. The 11th response was from a woman in Lawrence, Kansas, named Maggie Bancroft. She was 27 years old, she wrote, and she had been teaching in Lawrence for 4 years at the Watkins School for Girls, where she had taught reading, arithmetic, grammar, natural history, and basic surveying and land mapping. This last skill being something she had learned from her father, who had been a surveyor for the United States Land Office before his death in 1878. She had also, she mentioned in a matter-of-fact aside that struck Elijah as either deeply confident or entirely without vanity, trained as a field surveyor herself after her father's passing, and had done contract survey work in eastern Kansas for 2 years before deciding that the classroom offered more stability. She was fluent in written Spanish, having grown up near the Missouri-Kansas border during a period when trade Spanish was practically a survival skill. She was in good health. She could ride. She had no family obligations that would call her away from a position. She could begin in March. Her letter was the only one that made him feel, reading it, as though she was doing him a favor by applying rather than the other way around, and it annoyed him slightly, and he respected it enormously. He wrote back and offered her the position, and she accepted by return post with exactly 5 lines, the last of which was, "I will arrive on the 14th of March on the westbound stage. Please ensure someone meets it. I will have a trunk." She arrived with 2 trunks, as it turned out, and a leather satchel so heavy with instruments that the stage driver had made pointed remarks about it, and Elijah stood at the Weston stage stop with his eldest son Cole beside him and watched her step down from the coach. She was not what he had pictured, in the way that real people are never what you picture from letters. She was medium height and solidly built, with the kind of physical competence that shows in how a person moves rather than in any particular measurement. Her dark hair was pulled back severely. Her coat was good wool but thoroughly practical. She surveyed the main street of Weston with a quick, comprehensive look that reminded him oddly of the way he assessed a new piece of land, taking in the useful information and discarding the decorative. Then she looked at him and extended her hand, which he shook, and she said, "Mr. Hunter, thank you for coming." And then she looked at Cole and said, "You must be Cole. Your father says you are good with horses but behind in your reading. We will fix the second one and protect the first." Cole, who had been braced for condescension, stared at her for a moment with open suspicion, and then, involuntarily, almost smiled. Elijah loaded the trunks and they drove out to the ranch in the particular Kansas silence that either intimidates or settles you, depending on your nature, and Maggie sat beside him on the wagon seat and looked at the plains with the expression of a person who has been introduced to someone and is deciding whether they will get along. "It is flat," she said eventually. "Most of it," he agreed. "Good for surveying," she said. "I would not know," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You own 400 acres and you would not know. Have you ever had it properly surveyed?" "When I filed the claim," he said, "the county surveyor came out." "County surveyors in western Kansas in the 70s, she said, not unkindly, were sometimes more enthusiastic than accurate. "You might own more than you think, or less. Do you know your eastern boundary marker?" He did not with any precision. "I will look at your deed," she said, and turned back to the plains with the air of someone who has added an item to a mental list and filed it appropriately. The boys were waiting at the house. Thomas, who was 3 years old and consequently had no sense of social caution, walked directly up to Maggie when she stepped down from the wagon and said, "Are you going to be our new teacher?" "I am," she said, crouching to his level without any hesitation, which told Elijah something about her. "Can you spell elephant?" Thomas asked. "Elephant," she said. "Can you?" "No," Thomas said cheerfully. "You will be able to by the end of April," she told him. Jesse, who was 10 and had been badly hurt by his mother's death in the complicated way of a child old enough to remember but not old enough to process, held back. He looked at her from the porch with an expression that Elijah recognized as the particular closed-off wariness that Jesse had worn for nearly 2 years, the expression that said, "I will not love something I might lose again." Maggie did not push Jesse. She looked at him once, acknowledged him with a small nod as though he were an adult who had the right to his distance, and went inside to see her room. It was the right thing to do, and Elijah noticed. The first weeks were adjustment. An adjustment on a working ranch in the spring of 1882 is not a gentle thing. The days started at 5:30 in the morning because the ranch demanded it, and Maggie adapted to this without complaint. She had the kitchen organized within 3 days in a way that made Elijah's mornings run faster than they had in 2 years, not because she was performing domesticity for him, but because she had assessed the inefficiency with the same analytical eye. She turned on everything and corrected it. School happened from 8 in the morning until noon, in the main room of the house, which Maggie cleared of its accumulated ranch life disorder on the first day with a focused energy that made Elijah, watching from the doorway, feel the simultaneous prick of guilt and admiration. She had brought primers, arithmetic texts, a copy of a geography book that looked well-traveled, and a remarkable hand-drawn map of North America that she pinned to the wall, and which immediately became the object of Thomas's devoted attention. She taught the 3 boys at once, which Elijah had thought would be impossible given the gap in their ages and levels. But Maggie had a capacity for managing several things simultaneously that he found almost disconcerting. While Cole worked on composition exercises, she would run Jesse through multiplication tables with the quick, focused intensity of a woman who knows exactly how long a child's attention holds before it begins to slip. Thomas, meanwhile, was engaged with letter blocks or a picture primer at the table corner, close enough to feel included and far enough from his brothers that their more advanced work did not intimidate him. Elijah watched from outside the window more than he would have admitted. He told himself it was because he wanted to see how his sons were being treated. He told himself he was making sure the investment was sound. He was lying to himself on both counts, or at least on the second, because what he was actually doing was watching a woman think, and it was the most interesting thing he had encountered in years. The first time she truly surprised him was in the middle of March, not 3 weeks into her arrival, and it began with a cattle dispute that had nothing to do with her. The Fender brothers, who ran a small, ill-managed operation 6 miles south, had been claiming for 2 years that a strip of land along the southern creek belonged to them by right of an old claim marker. Elijah had argued this twice with words, once with a lawyer's letter that had cost him $40 and resolved nothing, and was currently enduring a situation in which Harlan Fender occasionally moved the marker post 6 inches further north, and Elijah moved it back, and the whole thing was childish and expensive and unresolved. Maggie heard about it at the dinner table, because Cole had mentioned it with the teenage outrage of a boy who has been listening to adult problems and absorbing their weight, and she asked 3 brief questions about the original deed description, the creek's current course versus its course in 1871, and whether Elijah had kept any letters from the original land office filing. He had, in a tin box in his desk. "May I look at them?" she asked. "They are my private documents," he said, which was technically true, and also, he recognized immediately, a ridiculous thing to say to someone he had hired specifically for her intelligence. "They are," she agreed evenly. "But if your original deed references a survey marker tied to a creek bend, and the creek has shifted in 11 years, which Kansas creeks do, then the legal boundary may be different from the physical one, and someone with surveying knowledge could establish exactly what the deed language actually means on the ground. However, it is your land and your documents, so if you would prefer to continue moving a fence post back and forth for another 2 years, that is also an option." Cole laughed, quickly suppressed. Jesse did not suppress it. Elijah said nothing for a moment, and then he got the tin box. She spent 2 evenings with the deed language and a set of surveying instruments from her leather satchel, including a compass, a measuring chain, and a small transit level that looked older than she was and clearly treasured. On the 3rd morning, she told him she was going to walk the southern boundary. "I will come with you," he said. "You do not need to," she said. "I will come with you anyway," he said. They walked the boundary in the sharp March cold, and Maggie moved along the creek with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this many times and trusts her own methods completely. She set up her transit level at 3 different points, sighted along it, made notes in a small book, consulted the deed language, paced measured distances with a counting under her breath that was clearly habitual rather than consciously performed. Elijah watched her work. He was a man who had spent 12 years learning to read a piece of land, to understand soil and water and weather, and he recognized in her movements the same quality of deep practical knowledge. She was not performing competence. She simply had it. After an hour, she said, "Your southern boundary, as described in your original deed, runs from the bent cottonwood at the northeast corner of the Fender claim to a sandstone outcrop that your deed calls the Gray Rock Formation bearing south-southwest from the creek bend. The creek has moved approximately 22 feet north since 1871, which I can tell from the old channel cut in the bank. That means the Fender's marker, which they have placed at the current creek edge, is 22 feet onto your land. You have the right to the entire strip. I can write up the survey description in language that any county official will recognize as professionally competent, and if the Fenders want to dispute it, they will have to hire their own surveyor to contradict me, which will cost them more than the land is worth to them." Elijah stood there in the cold creek wind and looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had been underestimated before and knew the specific flavor of that injustice, and he was not, he told himself, the kind of man who underestimated people. But he had not anticipated this. He had anticipated a good teacher. He had not anticipated someone who could in 2 evenings and 1 cold morning resolve a dispute that a lawyer had failed to touch. "You," he said, are either very good at this or very confident. Both, she said, without any false modesty and without arrogance, simply as a statement of fact. He was shocked, and he was deeply impressed, and something else shifted in him that he did not examine immediately. The way a man will look at a sunrise and not immediately name the feeling it produces, because naming it would require stopping, and he had not had time to stop in 2 years. The survey document she produced was meticulous. The Fenders did not contest it. The strip of land along the creek was resolved by April, and Elijah had 22 additional feet of good creek bottom grazing that he had not had before. Frank Donahue, who heard about it, said he needed to keep that woman on the property indefinitely for purely practical reasons, and then laughed at his own joke, and Elijah found he did not laugh along with it the way he might have expected to. Spring came on fast and warm that year, and with it a rhythm to the ranch that Elijah had not felt since Sarah died. Maggie did not attempt to be the boy's mother, and he noticed and was grateful. She was their teacher, which was different and perhaps in some ways more useful, because a teacher can maintain a kind of authority and warmth simultaneously without the terrible weight of grief that complicated everything a mother would have brought. She was affectionate with Thomas in the straightforward way of someone who finds small children genuinely interesting rather than merely lovable. She was patient with Jessie in a way that slowly, over weeks, began to dissolve the closed-off wariness he had worn since Sarah's death. Jessie's transformation was the thing that hit Elijah hardest, looking back on it. It happened in small increments, barely visible day by day, the way a wound heals. In late April, Jessie stayed after the official school hours to ask Maggie about a passage in the geography book. In early May, he asked her to look at a letter he had written to no one, just written, about a hawk he had seen hunting over the south pasture. She read it carefully and told him it was good and showed him 2 places where it could be better, and she did not make him feel smaller for the correction. And Jessie came to dinner that evening with something different in his face, a kind of cautious openness. Cole was more complicated because Cole was 13 and male, and had his father's particular brand of pride, which made accepting help feel like admitting inadequacy. Maggie handled this by never framing help as help. She framed it as collaboration. Tell me what you think is wrong with this paragraph, rather than here is what is wrong. It was a small and significant distinction, and Cole responded to it the way a plant responds to being given the right light, gradually and then all at once. By May, Cole was reading 2 grade levels ahead of where he had started. He did not say anything about this directly, but he brought Maggie a carved wooden bird one afternoon that he had made himself and set it on the schoolroom table without comment and walked out. And Maggie looked at it for a long moment and then set it carefully on the windowsill where it would catch the morning light. And when Cole came in the next day and saw it there, something in his face went quiet in a good way. Elijah saw all of this. He was working the ranch dawn to dusk as always, as a man must in the spring cattle season, but he came home to a house that was, in ways he found difficult to catalog precisely, alive again. Dinner conversation had returned. Not the polite, effortful conversation of people trying, but the real kind, where someone says something interesting and someone else argues with it, and a 10-year-old interrupts with a question that is either very astute or entirely irrelevant, and the table feels inhabited. Maggie had opinions about everything, and offered them without apology. She thought that the Kansas state government was mismanaging the land allocation process and would create problems for small ranchers within 20 years. She thought that the Great Plains soil, properly managed, could sustain more diverse agriculture than the current cattle monoculture. She had read about irrigation developments in California and thought they could be adapted for eastern Kansas. She thought that the treatment of Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples in Kansas was an ongoing injustice that would compound itself historically in ways that would shame future generations. And she said this clearly at the dinner table in a way that made Cole go quiet and thoughtful rather than dismissive. Elijah disagreed with her on some things and agreed with her on others, and found, in both cases, that the conversation was the most stimulating thing he had in his daily life. He had not really talked, with another adult in 2 years. He had talked at Frank Donahue and at the cattle buyers and at the hardware merchant in Weston, but talking at is not the same as talking with, and Maggie Bancroft talked with everyone she encountered, which was a quality so rare in Elijah's experience that he kept finding himself slightly startled by it. He was falling in love with her. He knew it by the middle of May, standing at the fence in the early evening watching the light change over the grass, and he acknowledged it to himself the way a man acknowledges a significant physical fact, that a fence needs replacing or a drought is coming. With resignation and with the full understanding that acknowledging a thing does not mean knowing what to do about it. She was his employee. She was here for a contracted year. She had given no indication, none whatsoever, that she thought of him as anything other than a reasonable employer in a professionally satisfactory situation. She was fiercely independent in every visible way, a woman who had made her own way after her father's death, who had established a professional reputation, who carried her own instruments and solved her own problems, and the very qualities that he had come to love were the qualities that made the idea of presuming to court her feel like the most presumptuous thing he had ever considered. He said nothing. He kept it to himself with the specific competence of a man who has learned to manage difficult internal weather. June arrived, and with it 2 things: an encounter that tested all of them, and the crisis that brought them to the yard with the fallen letter. The first thing was Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb had come to western Kansas the previous year from somewhere east, Tennessee perhaps, and had set himself up in a half-measure sort of way as a land speculator, identifying properties he thought were undervalued, which in practice meant identifying properties whose owners were under pressure, and applying pressure where it did not naturally exist. He was the kind of man who was perfectly charming in public and watched you very carefully while being charming, and Elijah had met him twice in town and formed a clear opinion of him that he kept to himself because it was rude to say. Webb arrived at the Hunter Ranch on a June afternoon when Elijah was in the far north pasture working on a section of down fence, and only Maggie and the boys were at the house. He arrived on a good horse with a good suit, and a story about being interested in buying grazing rights to the southern section, which was a lie so transparent that Maggie recognized it within 90 seconds of his opening remarks. She met him on the porch. Webb was smooth and slightly condescending in the way of a man who has found that condescension opens certain kinds of doors with women in frontier situations, and he leaned on the porch post and said he really should speak to Mr. Hunter, and Maggie said that Mr. Hunter was occupied and she could convey any business matter, and Webb said with a smile that this was the sort of thing that really required the man of the property. Maggie looked at him with the precise, unimpressed attention she gave to complicated survey problems. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I have Mr. Hunter's land deed, its legal description, and a survey document filed with the county office that establishes every boundary of this property. I also have a fair understanding of property law in the state of Kansas, and I can tell you that grazing rights on a section that is cross-referenced against a water easement from 1876 require a specific form of instrument that I would be happy to review if you have one prepared, or alternatively I can tell you that the approach you are currently taking, which involves arriving unannounced and speaking with an employee in the hope of establishing a preliminary agreement before the property owner is consulted, is not a method that will produce the result you are looking for here." Webb stared at her. "The boys are doing their arithmetic," she added. "I need to get back inside. If you want to make Mr. Hunter a formal written proposal, you may leave it with me. Good afternoon." She went inside. Webb sat on his horse for a moment and then rode away. When Cole told Elijah about this at dinner, with the specific relish of a 13-year-old who has witnessed an adult handled efficiently. Elijah put down his fork and looked across the table at Maggie. She was serving Jesse a second portion of potatoes and did not look up. "You did not need to do that," Elijah said. "No," she agreed, serving the potatoes. "I did not need to do a lot of things. I did them because they were useful," Jesse said. She told him good afternoon like it meant get off this property. "It did mean that," Thomas said, with the unearned authority of a 4-year-old. Elijah looked at Maggie for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and she looked back at him with those deep-water eyes, and the table went briefly quiet in the way it does when two people are having a conversation that the other people at the table can sense without being able to hear. Marcus Webb returned 2 weeks later, this time with a formal document and a figure that was, Elijah admitted privately, not terrible for the Southern grazing rights if he had been inclined to sell them, which he was not. But the document contained a clause in the third paragraph that subordinated Elijah's access to the creek in the southern section to Webb's grazing rights, which was the actual trap, the hidden motive that made the surface offer attractive, because without reliable creek access, the south section was worthless in a dry summer. Elijah had read land documents for 12 years and he had caught the clause, but it was Maggie who had caught it first, who had read through the document while Elijah was washing up for the day and had the page open and the clause indicated with a small pencil mark when he sat down. "That clause," she said, "is the only reason the offer exists." "I saw it," he said. "Good," she said, and closed the document. He looked at her. "You could have told me before I read it." "You needed to see it yourself," she said simply. "A man who spots the trap in his own documents trusts his own judgment. A man who is always told where the trap is starts to doubt whether he would have seen it." He sat with that for a long moment. "That is," he said, "a very particular kind of respect." "Yes," she said, "it is." He turned Webb's offer down in writing the next day, and Webb did not return. And then the crisis came, and it came, as crises on working ranches do, from a convergence of ordinary pressures that had been building without drama and resolved themselves all at once. The first element was a letter that arrived in the second week of June from the Watkins School in Lawrence, where Maggie had previously taught. The letter was from the school's director, a woman named Mrs. Eleanor Fitch, and it offered Maggie her old position back at a significantly increased salary, noting that the school had expanded its curriculum, and that Maggie's particular combination of educational skill and surveying knowledge was something the school wanted to incorporate formally into its program for older girls. Elijah did not see this letter. Maggie received it, read it, and sat with it for 3 days, and in those 3 days she was, he noticed, slightly quieter than usual. Not unhappy, exactly, preoccupied. The second element was a conversation he overheard between Cole and Jesse on the porch on a warm Thursday evening. He was coming around the side of the house and stopped before he rounded the corner because something in Cole's voice made him still. "She is not going to stay," Cole was saying, in the flat, certain voice of a boy who has decided to say the terrible thing out loud because having it unsaid is worse. "She has a contract until September. After September she will go back to Lawrence or somewhere else." Jesse was quiet for a moment. "Maybe Father will ask her to stay," he said. "Father would not ask anyone anything like that," Cole said, and the particular bitterness of it, the specific 14-year-old knowledge of his father's emotional constraints, hit Elijah harder than any physical blow he had experienced. "I do not want her to go," Jesse said. "Neither do I," Cole said. "Neither does Thomas, but wanting does not fix anything." "It might," Jesse said, and his voice had in it the specific quiet hope of a child who has lost one person and is trying to believe that loss is not the only possible outcome. Elijah stayed where he was for a long moment and then went quietly back around the barn and stayed there until dinner. The third element was the conversation he had with Frank Donahue on Friday morning over the fence, during which Frank, meaning well in the clumsy but genuine way of a good neighbor, said that he had heard from his wife that Maggie had received a letter from Lawrence, and that his wife had heard from the postmaster's wife that it looked like a school offer, and that if Elijah did not say something to that woman soon, he was a fool who deserved what he got. And Elijah told Frank to mind his business. And Frank said that minding his business was exactly what he was doing, because if Elijah lost the best thing that had happened to that ranch in years, it would affect the general morale of the entire eastern portion of the county. Elijah went home in a state that was not quite anger and not quite fear and not quite grief, but carried elements of all three. He found the letter that afternoon, not by searching, but because Maggie had left it on the kitchen table while she was teaching, and he came in for water and saw it and recognized the Lawrence letterhead before he could stop himself from reading the first visible lines. He should not have read it. He read it. He set it back exactly as it was and went outside and stood in the yard and looked at the planes for a long time. And the planes, which were very good at absorbing a man's difficulty without comment, absorbed this one too. That evening at dinner, he was quiet in the way that the boys recognized, the specific shutdown quiet that their father got when he was managing something internal that he had not yet decided how to handle. Maggie looked at him twice with the diagnostic attention she gave to things that were not working correctly and said nothing. After dinner, when the boys were in bed and the house was settled in its evening quiet, Elijah came into the kitchen where Maggie was reviewing the next week's school plans at the table, and he said, "The letter from the Watkins school." She looked up. Her pen stopped moving. She said nothing. "I saw it," he said. "I did not intend to read it. I read it anyway." "That was wrong of me." "Yes," she said, "it was. They are offering you more money than I can match," he said. "Yes," she said again. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and the particular defenselessness of a man who has decided to do a hard thing and is doing it badly and knows it. "The boys need you," he said. "That is the truth of it. Cole is reading at a level I could not have imagined in March. Jesse has opened up in ways I did not think were still possible for him. Thomas can spell elephant and 4 other large animals and is deeply proud of this fact." Maggie looked at him steadily. "But that is not," he stopped, started again. "That is not the only reason I am asking." The kitchen was very quiet. "Elijah," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the Mr. preceding it, and the sound of it in her voice was something he would remember for the rest of his life. "What are you asking?" He put his hat down on the counter. "I am asking you to stay past September, not as my employee, not under contract." He looked at her and he was, she would later tell him, the most obviously terrified she had ever seen a competent man be about anything. "I am asking you to stay as, I am asking whether you might consider." "Elijah," she said. "I am not good at this," he said. "I know," she said, but not unkindly. "I respect you," he said, and the word came out with the weight he meant it to carry, not as a politeness but as a fundamental statement. "I respect everything you are. The survey work and the way you caught Webb's claws and the way you handled Jesse and the way you talk at dinner about irrigation in California like it matters, which it does, and the way you told me I needed to find the trap myself because you respected my judgment. I respect all of it, and I have been, you are in love with me," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. She looked back at him for a moment that held itself still. "I received that letter 3 days ago," she said. "I have been trying to decide what to do, not because the offer is not good. It is a very good offer, but because," she stopped, and for the first time since March he saw something in her that was not composed, something that was working out how to cross a distance it was afraid of. Because leaving would mean leaving this house and those boys and this particular Kansas evening light, and she looked at him directly. "And you." "And I have been trying very hard not to admit that last part even to myself." The kitchen was silent. Elijah crossed the room in 3 steps and took her hands in both of his, which were large and rough and absolutely gentle, and looked down at her. "Stay," he said. "I am a surveyor," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "I am a school teacher. I am independent. I did not come here to become someone's wife. I know, he said. I know exactly who you are. I am not asking you to be someone else. I am asking whether who you are has any room for this. She looked at his hands holding hers. She looked at his face. She said quietly, "Ask me properly." He knew what she meant. He went down on one knee right there in the kitchen, on the worn plank floor, and he looked up at her and he said, "Maggie Bancroft, will you marry me? Not because the boys need a mother, though they do. Not because the ranch needs your particular mind, though it does. But because I love you and I am a better man for knowing you, and I want to spend the rest of my life in rooms where you are thinking about things." She laughed. It was a sudden, real laugh, the kind that surprises the person producing it, and her eyes went bright. "That is," she said, "the most honest proposal I have ever heard." "Is it the only one you have heard?" he asked. "No," she said. "There was a man in Lawrence who told me I was lovely and that he could offer me a comfortable life, and I told him I was not looking for comfort, I was looking for something true." "And is this?" he started. "Yes," she said. "Yes, it is." She reached down and took his face in both her hands and said, "Yes, Elijah, I will marry you." He stood up and he held her, and she let herself be held, and the kitchen held them both in its warm, ordinary light. This is how they arrived at the morning in the yard, the letter on the ground, the boys in the barn doorway, and the appearance of everything being over before it had truly begun. Because the morning after his proposal, before anything official had been said to anyone, before even the boys had been told, Elijah made a terrible and well-intentioned error. He was at breakfast early and Jesse came down first, and Elijah, flushed with the previous night's happiness and with the specific poor judgment of a man who has been carrying a joy alone and cannot contain it, said to Jesse, "I have something to tell you today. Something good." Jesse looked at him warily. Jesse had, in the 10 years of his life, learned that adult happiness preceded by secrecy was not always good in the way that adults meant it to be good. "Does it involve Miss Bancroft?" Jesse asked. "Yes," Elijah said, and he was smiling, and Jesse saw the smile and felt something that he did not have language for yet, something that was not quite fear and not quite anger, but was the specific protective wound of a child who has already lost one person he loved and cannot allow himself to survive another version of that loss. Jesse said nothing. He ate his breakfast. He went outside. But before school that morning, Jesse did something that Elijah would not know about until afterward. He went to Maggie in the schoolroom where she was setting up the day's work, and he said, very carefully, "My father told me you have something good to tell us today." Maggie looked at him. She understood, in the way she understood most things, what was actually happening. "Jesse," she said. "If you are leaving," he said, and his voice was flat and controlled in the terrible way of a 10-year-old performing grown-up equanimity, "it is better if you just go. It is better if you do not make it a big thing and then go, because Thomas will not understand. It will be bad for Thomas." "Jesse," she said. "It is better if you just go," he said again, and turned around and walked out of the house. Maggie sat with this. She sat with it for the length of the morning, teaching all 3 boys with her characteristic thoroughness, while underneath the lesson the weight of Jesse's words pressed against her chest. He had offered her an exit with the desperate generosity of a child who believes that protecting himself from hope is the only defense he has against loss. He had said, "It is better for Thomas." He had meant, "It is unbearable for me." And she had, in the night, been afraid. She had lain awake with Elijah's proposal and her own yes, and felt the full weight of what yes meant on a working ranch in Kansas in 1882. It meant a permanence she had never chosen. It meant children who were not hers but who had become something close to essential to her in 3 months, which was its own terrifying fact. It meant binding her life to a man she loved and trusted and being known, truly known by someone, which was what she had always wanted, and also, secretly, what she had always run from. After noon school, while the boys had their outdoor hour, Maggie sat at the table and she wrote a letter to Eleanor Fitch at the Watkins School, accepting the position. She did not know why exactly. She told herself it was because yes spoken in a kitchen at night is not the same as yes lived in daylight. She told herself it was because Jesse's face that morning had shown her what loss looked like in a child who could not survive it again, and she could not be responsible for that, could not be the person who made it worse by staying and then, eventually in some unforeseen way, failing them. She was terrified. That was the truth. She was deeply, bone-level terrified of how much she already loved all of them, and she was using Jesse's quiet courage as the excuse to run from her own. She finished the letter. She took it outside. She went to find Elijah. He was in the yard by the water trough, and she walked to him and she said, "I have to tell you something." And she held out the letter and he looked at it and his face closed like a door. He took it. He read it. He looked at her. "You are leaving," he said. "I think," she started. "Last night," he said very quietly, "you said yes." "I know what I said." "Then what is this?" She could not in that moment explain Jesse's face to him. She could not articulate the fear adequately. She said, "I need to think more carefully. I do not want to make a choice in the dark and discover in the light that I made it wrong." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he set the letter down in the dust, very deliberately, the specific gesture of a man returning something to its sender, and he said, "You are not making a choice in the dark. You made it last night in the light of the kitchen with your eyes open. And now you are afraid, and I understand that, but I need you to understand that I cannot." He stopped. His voice had gone rough in a way she had not heard before. "I cannot do this twice, Maggie. I cannot ask you to stay twice. If you walk through that door and write to Lawrence and go, I will not ask again." That was the moment. That was the fallen letter, the crying child in the barn, the terrible stillness of the yard. And then Thomas appeared in the barn doorway with hay in his hair and tears tracking through the dust on his face. Because Thomas had seen Miss Bancroft's face and recognized something wrong with the world. And Jesse was behind him with one hand on his brother's shoulder, and Cole stood apart with his jaw set, and his face wearing his father's expression. And Maggie looked at all of them and felt something inside her that had been clenched hard and tight for years simply break open. Not break in the direction of pain. Break the way a seed breaks. She looked at Jesse specifically. He met her eyes. In his face was the full, terrible, brave disclosure of a 10-year-old who had told her to go and was watching whether she would, and was already grieving the likelihood of it, and was holding Thomas's shoulder because Thomas needed holding, and was standing in the barn doorway because even now, even in the moment of expected loss, he was showing up for his family. She crossed the yard. She went to Jesse first. She crouched in front of him, right there in the dust, and she said, "I am not leaving because it would be easier for Thomas, and I am not leaving because it would be easier for you. I am not leaving at all. I was afraid this morning and I made a decision from the fear, and that was wrong." Jesse's jaw worked. "I am staying," she said, "not because of the contract, not because of the salary, because this is where I want to be, and I should have been brave enough to say that without needing Thomas's face in a barn doorway to make me honest." Jesse looked at her for a long-held moment. Then he said, very quietly, "Okay," and it was possibly the most restrained expression of enormous relief she had ever witnessed in a human being. Thomas, who had no restraint at all, wrapped both arms around her neck. She stood up, holding Thomas, and looked across the yard at Elijah. He was looking at her with an expression that she could not fully read, which was unusual, and she walked across the dirt yard toward him with Thomas heavy on her hip and stopped in front of him. "I was afraid," she said. "I know," he said. "I am still afraid," she said. "That does not go away because you asked me a beautiful question in the kitchen." "No," he agreed. "But I am more afraid of the alternative," she said. "And I know myself well enough to know that when the fear of leaving is bigger than the fear of staying, I should stay." He looked at her. He reached out one hand very slowly and touched her face, his rough thumb against her cheekbone, and said, "Then stay." "I am staying," she said. Thomas patted her cheek with a 4-year-old's helpful hand. Cole made a sound from the barn doorway that was very close to a laugh, and did not try to suppress it. They were married in September of 1882, in Weston, at the small Methodist church that had a pastor who was also a former buffalo hunter, and consequently had a very pragmatic view of what a wedding needed to accomplish. It was a simple ceremony and a full house, because the Hunter boys had apparently told everyone they knew, and Frank Donahue brought his wife and 7 children, and there was cake afterward that somehow fed everyone. Maggie wore her good blue dress and kept her hair down for the first time since March, and Elijah stood beside her at the front of the church in a suit that Cole had insisted on pressing. And when the pastor asked whether she took this man, she said, "I do," with the direct, undecorated certainty of a woman who has made her decision carefully and means to honor it. That night, after the boys were in bed, she and Elijah sat on the porch in the warm September dark, and she wrote a second letter to Eleanor Fitch declining the position with thanks, and Elijah sat beside her and watched her write it without saying anything, which was the correct thing. "Do you regret it?" he asked when she folded the letter. "Ask me in 20 years, she said, and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and the plains spread out around the ranch in their enormous, patient silence. Life after the wedding did not slow down or simplify, because it was a working ranch in Kansas, and simplicity was not on offer. But it had a quality of rightness that was different from the effortful functioning of the previous months. Maggie continued teaching the boys through the fall and winter, and the improvements continued. Cole, by November, was producing written compositions that Maggie said without flattery were better than anything she had seen from students 2 years older than him in Lawrence. And this assessment, delivered directly and without embellishment, meant more to Cole than any amount of praise would have, because he knew she did not produce false ones. Jesse, that fall, discovered that he had an aptitude for mathematics that went beyond what the standard primer could accommodate, and Maggie wrote to a bookseller in Kansas City and ordered 2 higher-level texts from her own money, which Elijah found out about and insisted on reimbursing, and which led to a brief, entirely affectionate argument that ended with Maggie saying fine and Elijah saying thank you, and both of them knowing that neither had fully won. Which was the correct outcome for a marriage between 2 people of strong character. Thomas, aged 4 and then 5 that winter, was learning to read with an enthusiasm that filled the schoolroom with his specific brand of loud, celebratory discovery. When he successfully read an entire sentence by himself for the first time, he stood up on his chair and announced it to the room, and Maggie lifted him off the chair before he could fall off it and told him he was entirely correct and that his brothers should take note. Elijah came in from the cold one December afternoon to find all 3 boys doing their lessons and Maggie at the window with her surveying transit, which she had set up apparently to verify something about the angle of the winter light. And there was a map on the table and a ruler and a book open to a section on agricultural geometry. And she was teaching Cole about land measurement using the actual survey instruments as objects, and Cole was looking at the transit level with the complete, absorbed attention of a boy who has found the thing that speaks to him directly. Elijah stood in the doorway and watched this and felt something that he did not try to name because it was too large and too various and naming it would diminish it. Maggie saw him. She said to Cole, "Your father is standing in the door looking either sentimental or hungry. Let us assume hungry and break for supper." Cole looked at his father. "He looks sentimental," Cole said with 13-year-old authority. "He does," Jesse agreed, without looking up from his arithmetic. "He is right there," Thomas pointed out helpfully. Elijah said nothing because they were not wrong. Spring came again, and with it, a development that none of them had discussed explicitly but that Maggie brought to Elijah's attention in the practical, direct manner that was entirely characteristic of her, which was to say she told him without preamble on a Sunday morning in April that she believed she was expecting a child, and he put down his coffee cup very carefully and looked at her. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Reasonably," she said. "I will be more certain in another month." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him with those precise, deep-water eyes trying to read him. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Surprised," she said. somewhat anxious about the timing relative to the spring survey I was planning. Mostly, she stopped, and something in her face opened in the way it rarely did, the specific vulnerability of a person who has kept their own counsel for so long that genuine feeling takes effort to voice. Mostly very glad, she said. He crossed the kitchen and held her face in both his hands and said, "So am I," and kissed her. And the kitchen, which had seen their proposal and their crisis and their resolution, held this moment too, as it held all the important ones. The pregnancy was confirmed and was, Maggie said with the detached professional assessment she applied to her own body, straightforward. She continued teaching through the summer with the boys' 3 months older minds and her expanding presence both informing the household's daily life in various ways. The boys had been told in May, and the reactions were precise and characteristic. Cole said, "All right," in his careful teenager's voice, and then spent the rest of the day slightly louder and more useful than usual, which was his way of celebrating. Jessie asked several thoughtful questions about what this would mean for the school schedule. Thomas immediately began telling anyone who came to the ranch, including a cattle buyer who had come purely about steers, that there was going to be a baby. The baby arrived in December of 1883, in a long and serious labor that had Elijah at the foot of the bed, with the doctor from Weston who had been called the night before, and Maggie who had read everything available on the subject and had specific, informed opinions about the process that she communicated clearly between contractions. The doctor, who was a sensible man, listened to her. A boy. They named him William after Maggie's father, the surveyor. William Hunter arrived in the world loud and particular, with dark hair like his mother and Elijah's exact square jaw, and Cole held him first after the parents, with the careful, slightly overwhelmed solemnity of a 15-year-old confronting a new reality, and Jessie held him second and said very little but looked down at the baby's face with an expression that healed something in Elijah that he had not known was still broken, and Thomas held him third and said, very seriously, "He is small." And Maggie said, "He will grow," and Thomas considered this and accepted it. Life continued to expand. The ranch grew. Elijah bought the adjacent 40 acres from a struggling neighbor in 1884, and Maggie surveyed the boundary herself, 6 months after William's birth, which she accomplished by putting the baby in a sling arrangement of her own devising and walking the boundary with her instruments while William slept against her chest. And Cole, who had come along to help carry equipment, watched this with an expression that was, Elijah thought when Cole described it that evening, a mixture of permanent impression and slight alarm. Cole, by the time he was 16, had absorbed so much of Maggie's surveying knowledge that she sat down with him formally one afternoon and told him that if he wished to pursue training as a professional surveyor, she could write him a reference to the Kansas State Land Office that would carry weight, because she had a professional reputation there, and her word on a promising student would open a door. Cole looked at her for a long moment with his 16-year-old face and then said, "I know," and the two words carried in them everything a boy who has been seen can say. He did pursue it. At 17, he began working summers with a county surveying team. At 20, he had his own licensure and a professional reputation that was, Maggie noted with satisfaction that she did not bother to conceal, built on a solid foundation. Jessie, who had the mathematical gift that the ordered structure of the frontier could not fully accommodate, received a letter in 1887, at the age of 16, from a teacher at the Topeka High School who had heard about him through a network of Kansas educators that Maggie was still part of, and the letter invited him to test for a scholarship. Jessie went to Topeka and took the test and came home with the scholarship in his pocket and an expression on his face that was the direct adult successor to the one he had worn at 10 years old in the barn doorway, the expression of someone who had stopped protecting himself from hope. Elijah drove him to Topeka in September 1887, and Jesse shook his father's hand on the street outside the school building with the formality of a young man establishing himself as a peer. And Elijah shook back and said, very quietly, "Your mother would have been proud of you." And Jesse stood still for a moment, receiving this, and said, "Maggie is proud of me. I know because she tells me exactly what she thinks, and she told me." "Yes," Elijah said, "that is true." "They are both true," Jesse said. "Yes," Elijah agreed. "They are both true." Thomas turned 13 in 1892 and had his biological mother Sarah's, gift for people, the specific warmth and ease with others that made everyone around him feel comfortable and known. Maggie had identified this years before and directed his education accordingly, giving him the rhetoric and writing and history that would support a person whose life would be built on human connection. By 18, he was helping Elijah manage the ranch's business dealings with a natural fluency that was, Elijah said, nothing he had taught the boy and everything Maggie had. In 1889, Maggie had their second child, a daughter they named Clara, and Clara was, from approximately the age of 18 months, going to be a force of nature. She had her mother's focused intelligence and her father's stubbornness and her brother William's particular loudness about her own thoughts. And the combination, Elijah said to Maggie one evening while they watched Clara instruct her 3-year-old brother William on the correct way to approach a horse, was going to be magnificent and challenging in equal measure. Maggie leaned against the fence beside him and watched their daughter with the look that never entirely changed, the surveyor's look, comprehensive and respectful. "She is going to do exactly what she wants with her life," Maggie said. "Yes," Elijah said. "I intend to make sure she has every tool available to do it well," Maggie said. "I know," he said. "I have never doubted that." He looked at her sideways. "She already knows how to use the compass." "She is 3, Maggie said. "She should know how to use the compass." He laughed, and it was the easy, full laugh of a man in his middle life who has been loved well and knows it. The winter of 1890 brought a particular hardship to the Kansas plains that was not unique to the Hunter Ranch, but that tested every family in eastern Kansas. A drought that had begun the previous summer persisted, and the grass that the cattle depended on was inadequate, and several of their neighbors were in genuine financial danger. Elijah was managing, because the ranch was well established and diversified enough to sustain the pressure. But the margins were thin, and the anxiety that settled over the plains that winter had the specific quality of a dark past threatening to reassert itself, the fear that all the work might not hold. Maggie, who had for years been collecting data in her field notes about precipitation patterns, soil conditions, and water table levels across the portion of eastern Kansas she had surveyed, sat down in January with her notebooks and her maps, and produced a document over the course of 2 weeks that was, essentially, a detailed analysis of where the water actually was on the Kansas plains versus where conventional wisdom placed it, and which sections of land had access to subsurface water that could be tapped with a well of the right depth and placement. She shared this document first with Elijah, who read it twice and said, "You have been collecting this data for 7 years. "Yes," she said. "You knew when we bought the East 40 that there was subsurface water at around 30 feet, he said. "I believed it with reasonable confidence," she said. "Why did you not tell me that at the time?" She considered this. "Because you had already decided to buy it," she said. "And if I told you there was subsurface water, you would have thought I was supporting your decision rather than making my own assessment of it. The data was the same either way. The well we dug later confirmed it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Do you know," he said, "that there are times when you are the most complicated person I have ever met?" "Yes," she said cheerfully. "Do you want me to share this document with the county agricultural office?" "Yes," he said. "Take it to Weston. Take it to Topeka if necessary. If there are families out there who can put a well in the right place based on this and save their cattle, then do that." She took it to Weston first, and then to Topeka, where she presented it to the Kansas State Board of Agriculture in March of 1890. and the board, which was not accustomed to receiving data of this quality from a woman in a practical Western dress with ink-stained fingers and a very direct manner, sat through her presentation in a state of increasing visible impression, and then asked her 14 questions, all of which she answered, and then offered to publish the document in the State Agricultural Bulletin, and she said yes. The bulletin went out in April. 3 families in eastern Kansas, who might otherwise have sold their land and left, used the water table information to cite wells that got them through the drought. Elijah heard about 2 of these families from Frank Donahue and 1 from the postmaster, and he came home and told Maggie, and she said, "Good," in the way that meant more than the word itself contained. The years moved. William was 10 in 1893 and was already helping Elijah with the cattle management in the mornings before school, with a focused competence that would have been impressive in a boy 5 years older. He was not as academic as Cole or as mathematically gifted as Jesse, but he had an extraordinary understanding of animals and land that was his own kind, and Maggie taught him natural history with particular care, and recognized in him something that she said to Elijah was a rancher's gift, the deep, intuitive reading of the natural world that cannot be entirely taught and should never be wasted. Cole came back to the ranch in the spring of 1893 with his surveying license and his professional reputation, and notably, a young woman named Helen who was a schoolteacher in Topeka and who had been introduced to Cole by a colleague of Maggie's, a coincidence that Maggie disclaimed entirely and that Elijah did not believe for a moment. Cole married Helen in the fall of 1893, a small ceremony in Weston, and Elijah stood beside his eldest son and thought about the boy who had been 13 and silent in the barn doorway, and felt the specific, complicated fullness of a parent watching a child become a person. Jesse came home for the wedding from Topeka, where he was teaching mathematics at the high school and working on a correspondence with a mathematician at the University of Kansas who had noticed his papers. He arrived on the stage with books in his bag and the specific, comfortable happiness of a young man who is exactly where he should be in his life, and he and Maggie spent 2 evenings deep in a mathematical conversation that Elijah could not follow and did not try to, sitting across the room listening to the sound of it with the uncomplicated pleasure of a man in his own house on a peaceful night. Thomas, at 22, was managing a significant portion of the Hunter Ranch's commercial operations and had just begun courting the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a young woman named Ruth who had the specific, warm practicality of someone who grew up on the plains and loved them without sentiment. Elijah approved of Ruth in the instinctive way, and Maggie, who never approved of anyone instinctively but always arrived at the same destination through careful observation, said after Ruth's 3rd visit that she had noticed Ruth listen to Thomas the way that smart people listen to others they find genuinely interesting. And this, Maggie said, was more reliable than any other indicator. Thomas and Ruth were married in 1895, and Ruth came into the household with the ease of someone who had been watching it from outside for long enough to know its rhythms, and she and Maggie built a friendship over the following years that had the quality of 2 very different but equally competent women who recognize in each other the essential thing and respect it without needing to discuss it. In 1895, Maggie did something that she had been considering for 3 years. She opened a small school in Weston. Not the existing school, which continued, but an evening and Saturday school for girls and young women of the area who had aged out of the standard schooling, but who had not had access to the kind of education that their brothers had been able to get. She taught reading and writing at advanced levels, and mathematics and surveying, and she charged a minimal fee that she waived without comment for families who could not afford it. Elijah helped her set up the schoolroom in a rented space on Weston's Main Street, hauling desks and building shelves on a Saturday morning in September, while Maggie organized her materials with the comprehensive efficiency that had characterized her since March of 1882, and when the room was done she stood in the middle of it and looked around at the result. "It is good," she said. "It is excellent," he said. She looked at him. "You have been supporting this without being asked since I first mentioned it." "Yes," he said. "Why?" she said, in the direct way that was actually a question and not a rhetorical one. "Because you are the most capable person I have ever known," he said, "and because every woman you teach in this room is going to have something she would not have had otherwise. And I watched you give that to my sons for years, and now you are giving it to other people's daughters. And there is not a single reason in the world for me to be anything other than proud of that." He looked at her steadily. "Also, frankly, because it makes you happy, and your happiness matters to me more than you have ever fully believed." She was quiet for a moment. "I believe it," she said quietly. "I have come to believe it." The school opened in October 1895 with 11 students between the ages of 14 and 22, and by the following spring it had 23, and by 1897, Maggie had a second teacher assisting her, a young woman named Dora who had been one of her first students, and who had the specific gratitude-turned-competence of someone who knows exactly what they were given and intends to pass it on. Clara Hunter, at 10 years old in 1899, was already attending her mother's school on Saturdays and was already, in Maggie's careful and uninfluenced assessment, the most naturally gifted student she had ever taught. This was said at the dinner table in Clara's presence, because Maggie did not believe in hiding professional assessments from their subjects when the subjects could benefit from them. And Clara received this information with the equanimity of a child who has always suspected it, and is gratified but not surprised. William, at 16, had taken over the morning cattle checks from his father 3 days a week, and managed them with a responsibility and skill that made Elijah say to Maggie privately that the ranch was in good hands for the next generation. And Maggie said she had been confident of that since William was 8 years old, and managed a difficult horse with more patience than most adults. Elijah, at the turn of the century, was 53 years old and fully present in a life that had been rebuilt from grief and necessity into something rich and particular. He was not a man who wrote things down or made speeches, but on the evening of the 1st of January in 1900, he sat on the porch with Maggie in the cold while inside the house William and Clara argued cheerfully about something and the fire was warm through the walls, and he said to her, "I have been thinking." "You think quietly," she said. "I have never been entirely sure what happens in there." "Very little that is eloquent," he said. "But I have been thinking that when I placed that advertisement in 1882, I was looking for someone to teach my sons. I was not looking for—" He stopped. "I was not looking for any of this." She looked at him in the cold January night. "And I have been thinking," he said, "that whatever a man asks for in desperation and whatever he actually needed are usually different things, and if he is very fortunate those two things become the same person." She was quiet for a moment. "That is," she said, "almost poetic." "Almost," he agreed. "You are not usually almost poetic," she said. "It is a new century," he said. "I am making an effort." She laughed and put her hand in his, and they sat in the January dark with the plains around them, and the house warm behind them, and the long, complete life that they had built together between them, as solid and true as a well-surveyed boundary line. Cole and Helen had 3 children by 1900, and Cole's surveying work had become significant enough that he was regularly consulted by the county on disputed land claims. And he had, in a quiet piece of justice that Maggie heard about from Frank Donahue's wife, been the professional who resolved a particularly intractable boundary dispute involving, of all people, the Fender brothers' descendants. He had handled it with precision and documented fairness, and Maggie, hearing this, said nothing, but she was smiling in the way she smiled when something that should have happened did. Jesse was at the University of Kansas by 1900, teaching mathematics at the university level and working on a textbook that he dedicated, simply and without elaboration, to MH. And anyone who knew him knew what the initials meant. Thomas and Ruth had 2 children and a prosperous ranch of their own, adjacent to the Hunter property, and Sunday dinners at the Hunter house, when everyone who could come came, had the specific, glorious chaos of a large and living family, with children at the table edges and adults talking over each other, and Elijah at the head of the table, saying very little and watching all of it with the face of a man who knows he is looking at everything good that his life has produced. Maggie's school had grown into a proper institution by 1902, housed in a building of its own that the town of Weston had helped fund, because even those citizens who had been skeptical in 1895 had by now seen what a room full of educated women did for the families and businesses of a frontier town, and the skepticism had converted to the specific civic pride of people who are glad something exists, even if they did not support it at the start. William, at 20 in 1903, took over the primary management of the Hunter Ranch from Elijah in the formal, documented way that Elijah had been preparing for 3 years, and Elijah, who had worked the land for 32 years, handed over the management papers with the equanimity of a man who has worked hard enough for long enough to be at peace with letting the next generation carry it. He spent more time on the porch. He spent more time in the evenings reading by the fire, the books that Maggie had kept on the shelves for 20 years, and that he had read more of than he would have admitted in 1882. He rode out some mornings simply to ride, with no agenda, which he had not done since he was 24 years old coming west for the first time. Clara, at 15 in 1904, was the best student at Maggie's school and also the most argumentative, which Maggie considered a feature rather than a problem. She was already corresponding with a geologist at the State University who had read Maggie's 1890 water table document and been told by Maggie directly that her daughter was asking questions about soil strata that went beyond what she could answer, and the geologist had written back with resources and questions of his own. In the evenings, Elijah and Maggie sat together as they had been sitting together for 20 years, with the specific comfortable ease of 2 people who know each other completely, and find the knowledge a pleasure rather than a diminishment. They talked about the children, about the ranch, about the school, about things they had read, about the century that was young and the one that was gone. They disagreed occasionally with the productive disagreement of 2 people who respect each other's reasoning and do not need to win. They sat in the particular silence that is not absence but presence, the silence of 2 people who have been through enough together that silence itself is a form of communication. In 1905, Maggie received a letter from the Kansas State Agricultural College in Manhattan, Kansas, inviting her to give a series of lectures on practical surveying and land management, based on the 1890 water table document, and subsequent work she had published in the State Bulletin. The letter addressed her as a recognized authority in applied land survey methodology. She read it at breakfast and set it down and drank her coffee. Elijah watched her. "Well," he said, "I am 50 years old," she said. "Yes," he said, "they want me to lecture at the agricultural college," she said. "Yes," he said, "I gathered." "I have never been to Manhattan," she said. "It is 6 hours by train," he said. She looked at him. "Are you suggesting I go?" "I am suggesting that you are a recognized authority in applied land survey methodology," he said, "and that the agricultural college would be fortunate to have you, and that if you would like to go I will hold down the ranch and the household in the school's opening week while you do." She looked at him for a long moment. "You," she said, "are a thoroughly good man." "Finally," he said, "it only took you 23 years to say it directly." "I have said it indirectly many times," she said. "You have," he agreed, "but I appreciate the directness." She went to Manhattan. She gave 4 lectures over 2 weeks to students and faculty who, by the 4th lecture, were treating her with the specific attentive respect of people who have encountered someone operating well above the level they expected. The college asked her to submit a paper for their annual publication. She submitted one that she had been writing in her notebooks for 3 years. She came home on a Friday evening in October, and Elijah met her at the Weston station, and she stepped off the train with her leather satchel and her direct gaze, and the specific bearing of a woman who has just done something she is justifiably satisfied with. And he looked at her from the platform and thought, as he had thought in various forms for 23 years, that she was the most remarkable person he had ever known. She walked to him. He took the heavy satchel from her shoulder. "How was it?" he asked. "Excellent," she said. "There was a student in the third lecture who asked a question about alluvial soil formation that I could not fully answer without more data. I told him so, and he looked so surprised that I told him honestly I did not know something that I had to explain to him, that acknowledging the limits of your knowledge is how you extend them, and then I wrote him down the 3 sources he should consult." "Did he?" "He wrote to me already," she said, "before I even got on the train home." Elijah laughed. They walked to the wagon in the early October light, and he helped her up and climbed up beside her, and the horse knew the way home as it always had, and the plains opened out around them in their enormous, patient, beautiful silence, and the drive home was 20 minutes, and they were quiet for most of it in the good way. The house, when they arrived, was lit from inside with the warm light of evening, and through the window they could see William at the table and Clara beside him with a book, and the kitchen was warm with the smell of the meal that had been kept for her, and the ranch was solid and dark in the evening around them. 440 acres that had been surveyed to the last inch by the woman who lived on it, whose boundaries were known, whose water was found, whose next generation was ready. Elijah stopped the wagon and helped her down, and she stood in the yard in the October dark, their yard, the same dirt yard where a letter had once fallen between them like an accusation, and she looked at the lit window and the house and the plains beyond it, and she breathed in the cold grass smell of Kansas in autumn. "Home," she said. Not a question. "Home," he said. He took her hand and they walked inside together, into the warmth and the light and the voices and the mess and the life, the full, resolved, abundant life that had grown from 2 people who had needed each other in ways neither had known to name. And the door closed behind them on the dark prairie evening, and the plains kept their eternal silence around the house, and inside it everything was exactly as it should be. Clara became a geologist in time. She was the first woman to hold a professional geology certification in the state of Kansas in 1913, and the paper she published in 1916 on subterranean water mapping in the Central Plains was cited in agricultural journals for decades, and it began with a dedication that read, "To my mother, who taught me that the ground holds more than it shows, and the proper instrument and steady patience will find it." William ran the Hunter Ranch until he was 60 years old, and then his eldest son ran it after him, and the land stayed in the family, well surveyed and well managed, into a century that Elijah and Maggie had not seen the end of, but whose beginning they had shaped with their hands. Elijah Hunter died in 1918, at 71 years old, in the house he had built, in the bed where his children had been born, and where his wife lay beside him in the still early morning. He had been failing since spring, the slow, gentle failing of an old body that has worked honestly for 50 years, and he was not afraid of it. He had said everything he needed to say. He had lived everything he needed to live. Maggie was 63, and she held his hand, and she did not say anything because there was nothing that needed saying that had not already been said 100 different ways over 36 years. In the kitchen and the yard and the porch and the plains, in the survey notes, and the school and the boundary lines and the boys who had become men and the children who had become themselves. She buried him in the Weston Cemetery beside the grave of Sarah Hunter, because she was the kind of woman who understood what it meant to honor all the people a man had loved, and she thought it was right. She ran the school for 7 more years, and then she handed it to Dora and Dora's daughter, who had both been her students, and she went home and sat on the porch and looked at the plains. The plains looked back as they always had, vast and patient and full of water in the right places if you knew where to look. She knew where to look. She always had.